Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well and you have had a good weekend. This week we are going to be looking at globalization, and I'm going to break this lecture into parts so that it's more easily digestible for you. Today we are going to be looking at the fall of communism, the rise of neoliberalism, and the struggle of labor. So the fall of communism marked a significant milestone in the 20th century. In fact, many argue it was a turning point in history that reshaped the political landscape and impacting the lives of millions of people. We have covered this already when discussing the Eastern Bloc crisis, but let's quickly build a connecting thread because to understand what is new, we must always assess what was there before. The rise of communism established the Soviet Union as a major communist power, right? By 1985, the USSR economy was collapsing, the Cold War arms race suffocating. And let's not forget the internal unrest from the people within the USSR about the constant failing of the government. So by November 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall happened, this signaled the fall of communism in the form of the USSR and that the West liberal capitalist democracy had won the Cold War. So this signaled the end of alternative visions of society. There's a quote by Fukuyama. He once said, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. And he said this in his book. The book is called The End of History and the Last Man. So this signaled an important ideological break and turning point across the globe. A new phase of capitalism that had started to emerge from the 1970s had now become dominant, hegemonic. And so, for this last block of teaching, we are going to look at the emergence of the new phase of capitalism called neoliberalism. So, before we talk about neoliberalism as a newer phase of capitalism, we need to understand that capitalism has undergone various phases throughout history. While different scholars may classify and name these phases differently, here is a general, more clinical way of thinking about the phases in some chronological order. So, phase one, mercantilism. This was an early form of capitalism prevalent from the 16th to the 18th century. It involved state-controlled trade and accumulation of wealth through exports and colonization. Phase two, which is industrial capitalism, also known as the Industrial Revolution. This phase emerged in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th century. It was characterized by the shift from agrarian societies to industrialized economies, with the introduction of new machinery, mass production, and the establishment of factories. Phase three would be finance capitalism. This phase arose in the 19th and early 20th century. It was marked by the increasing dominance of financial institutions and the growing importance of banking and investment capital in the economy. This phase witnessed the rise of large corporations and the emergence of stock markets. And then now looking at phase four, this is welfare capitalism. This phase emerged in the early 20th century, particularly after World War II. Welfare capitalism aimed to strike a balance between the interests of capital and the well-being of workers. It involved the introduction of social welfare programs, labor regulations, and collective bargaining to mitigate some of the negative effects of capitalism. Then looking at stage five, it's state capitalism. This phase involves significant government intervention in the economy. State capitalism can take different forms. It generally refers to a system where the state exercises substantial control over key industries or sectors through regulations, subsidies, or ownership. It often arises during periods of economic crisis or in countries with centralized economic planning. Now, when we were talking about World War One and World War Two with Dr. Besadenhout, industrial capitalism was still the dominant system phase of capitalism. So capitalism was still the dominant system of capitalism. The world was in then many capitalist countries were engaging in war efforts and required the mobilization of resources, production, and labor on a massive scale. So industrial production was geared towards supporting the war. with with the manufacturing of weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and other war-related supplies. So now, looking at this, at the same time, the governments played an increasingly active role in the economy during the war. They imposed regulations, directed resources towards the war effort, and implemented measures to control prices, wages, and production. So war economies relied heavily on state intervention, and many industries were either directly owned or closely controlled by the state. In World War II, we saw an even greater level of state intervention in the economy compared to World War I. Overall, World War I and World War II marked periods of heightened state intervention in capitalist economies, driven by the need for war mobilization and coordination of resources. So while industrial capitalism remained the underlying economic system, the extent of state involvement and control increased significantly during these wartime periods. So creating a hybrid mix of industrial and a state type capitalism. So when we first got together, we spoke about decolonization. You'll begin to notice that the phase of capitalism that existed during decolonization varied across different regions and countries, depending on their specific historical context and the nature of the decolonization process. So, however, a common characteristic during this period was the continuation or the emergence of state capitalism. So state capitalism played a significant role in post-colonial period as countries pursued economic development and nation building, right? So governments often intervened in the economy through policies such as import substitution, industrialization, um, which is ISI, or state-led development strategies. So these policies aimed to promote domestic industries, protect local sectors, and reduce reliance on imports. So, however, it is important to note that the specific nature and extent of state capitalism during decolonization, it varied greatly. So some countries adopted more socialist or centrally planned approaches, nationalizing major industries and implementing comprehensive economic planning, right? So others pursued mixed economies combined with state intervention, with elements of free market capitalism and private enterprise. And then furthermore, external influences such as the Cold War dynamics and the influence of internal financial institutions also shaped the economic policies of newly independent nations. So many countries face challenges in balancing their aspirations for economic independence with the pressures and interests of global capitalism. So the phase of capitalism during decolonization was characterized by a mix of state capitalism with varying degrees of state intervention, economic planning, and state ownership of key industries. So the specific strategies and approaches that were adopted by different nations actually depended on their unique circumstances, aspirations, and the global political and economic climate of that time. So when we look at phase six, it's neoliberalism. So neoliberalism emerged in the 20th century as a response to perceived limitations of state intervention. It emphasized the reduction of government regulation, free trade, privatization, and the promotion of market forces as the driving factors of economic growth. So it is important to note that these phases are not rigidly separated, and elements of different phases may coexist or overlap in different periods and regions. Additionally, there are varying interpretations and debates about the specific boundaries and characteristics of each phase, especially its impact to labor, which we will deal with in relation to the South African context. So, neoliberalism is an important part of the global history of capitalism. This course has naturally taken us through many countries, past from mapping out the world wars to understanding the Cold War, and then the Eastern Bloc, and zooming into Africa through the lens of decolonization. For this next part, we will focus on neoliberalism and its implications for South Africa, especially labor. But to understand neoliberalism today, specifically the type in South Africa, we must first dive back into South Africa's history, looking back to understand how we got here. So neoliberalism in the 1970s, 1980s predates the South African democracy, meaning this phase of capitalism existed before the South African Revolution of the 1980s, and thus had an incredible influence to the type of transition that occurred when we moved away from apartheid to post-apartheid South Africa. As we will see, this is what differentiates our transition from that of many of the African states that gained independence in the 1950s and the 1960s. So Adam Smith um, Smith's Wealth of the Nations really relays a foundation for this phase of capitalism, arguing that individual freedom was more important, that societies consisted of individuals, not nations or communities, but rather driven by self-interest. So understanding the underpinnings of neoliberalism. So economic freedom is key to individual freedom. He argued for the need to move away from large states to small states that offered little interference or restrictions on the economy and free, unrestricted trade. What we call the laissez-faire. This is a massive different approach when you compare it to the state capitalism in phase 5. He argued for the market to run it independently as much as possible. So market self-regulatory, a market self-regulatory the invisible hand, again emphasizing the role of the state was not to influence the market like the past phases, but rather to trust the market to self-correct. And then the fourth one, economic growth. If the first three pillars mentioned above were met, then economic growth would become inevitable because the economy is not finite, and that a growing economy keeps us with the supply of labor, thus creating employment. So now, how do these phases come about within capitalism? So when we look at the world before neoliberalism, the 1920s to 1970s, when we read history, one thing is clear. So capitalism, while persistent, generally always falls into crisis. However, some of these crises at first seem to have decisively ended capitalism until later on um, we realize that instead capitalism is almost like reborn into an interconnected phase, linking previous versions of itself and adding to a new element. So you will remember the Eastern Bloc, the USSR. Communism was meant to be a direct response to a specific type of capitalism that was failing, but the reality is, in the end, this pushed mankind forward, but it did not end capitalism. So, as such, we can say that capitalism is dynamic. Some, including the likes of Karl Marx, argued capitalism was innovative and was even acknowledged by the USSR that capitalism was indeed necessary, but it is also unstable. So we have experienced three deep crises over the last 120 years that have led to different phases of capitalism. So let's look at the first two. So the crisis of 1870 and 1880 refers to a period of economic turmoil and financial instability that occurred in various parts of the world during the late 19th century. It was characterized by a series of economic recessions, financial panics, and social unrest. So here's a brief explanation of the key factors and consequences of the crisis. So some historians refer to the crisis as the Long Depression. So the crisis began with the Long Depression, which started in 1873 and lasted until the mid-1890s. So it was triggered by an international financial panic originating in Europe and quickly spread to other regions. The Long Depression was marked by a prolonged downturn in global trade, falling commodity prices, widespread bankruptcies, and high unemployment rates. Overproduction and agricultural slump. So when we look at this, the crisis was fueled by overproduction in various industries, particularly in the agricultural sector. Advances in agricultural technology led to increased output, resulting in a surplus of goods and declining prices. So this led to financial distress for the farmers and the agricultural workers, exacerbating social and economic tensions. Then there was speculative bubbles and financial panics. Then, so in the 1870s and 1880s, saw several speculative bubbles and subsequent financial panics. So in the United States, the collapse of the J. Cook and Company, a major banking and investment firm, in 1873 triggered a severe economic downturn known as the Panic of 1873. Similar financial panics occurred in Europe and other parts of the world, causing widespread bank failures, credit crunches, and economic instability. Then there was social unrest and political movements. The economic hardships of the crisis period contributed to social unrest and the emergence of various political movements. So, workers' movements, trade unions, and socialist and anarchist ideologies gained traction as people sought to address economic inequalities and poor working conditions. And then there was a shift in economic power. The crisis of 1870s and 1880 had lasting effects on the global economy. It marked a shift in economic power, with the United States and Germany emerging as new industrial powers, challenging the economic dominance of Britain. This period also witnessed the rise of protectionism and intensification of imperialist rivalries as nations sought to secure resources and markets. And then now, the crisis of the 1870s and 1880s had a significant impact on economic, social, and political developments during that time. It revealed structural weaknesses in the global economy, prompted debates about the role of the state in economic affairs, and set the stage for further economic transformation and reforms in the following decades. So, the proposed solution for the crisis was then pushing out the liberalism agenda, arguing for less state regulation in big economies. The second was imperialism, major expansion into less developed countries to serve as strategic outlets for surplus created by capitalism, hence the scramble for Africa. The second big crisis of the 1920s and 1930s, well, it's the world wars, and we all know how that went down, right? So, the World War and the Great Depression, where the stock markets crashed. There was huge amount of social unrest. The Russian Revolution, for many then and many scholars even today, the Russian Revolution at the beginning symbolized the deathbed of capitalism. Not only that, but an ideology, a new way of thinking began to dominate, which was socialism existed as a real alternative to capitalism, while simultaneously global politics began to be shaped by the long Cold War, right? So, in response to this crisis, a new phase came about where the state played a key role in building and planning the economy. So, this is what led to the shift to communism, where the state owned and ran the entire economy, literally the whole economy. There was no private sector, no private property. And then the union of Soviet socialist republics, the Soviet Union or the USSR, under China under Mao Zedong, and Cuba under Fidel Castro. So this was regulated capitalism. Um, it created a legitimate capitalism with a human face, we could say. So that had a different approach to even labor and trade unions, as we will soon see in the next chapter or in the next, yeah, next part of our lecture.